I have been in your shoes. I wrote a novel and then I had to find an agent, and that meant I had to write a query letter that worked. I've also been on the other side of the computer. I was a literary agent for 8 years and I read thousands and thousands of query letters, some of them good, some of them really not so good. So I know what works. My name is Nathan Bransford. Thank you for spending this time with me to talk about all things related to the dreaded query letter. Here's what we're going to go over. What is a query letter and why do you need one? How to write a killer plot description for fiction or your key selling points for nonfiction. How and why to personalize your query letter and why it's important. The nuts and bolts you need to include, including your genre, word count, comp titles, bio, things like that. The best strategy for sending out your query letters. And I'm going to share with you my query letter for Jacob Wunderbar that landed me an agent and led to the Jacob Wunderbar series. So, what is a query letter and why do you need one? If you're pursuing traditional publication, you need a literary agent. And the way to get a literary agent is usually via a query letter. So here's what it is. A query letter is a brief letter describing your project. It's usually between 250 to 350 words. So it's short, punchy, to the point, and includes all the relevant detail an agent needs to evaluate your project and find out if they want to read more and they want to consider representing you. Before you query, you need to have a completely finished and polished novel if you're writing fiction, and that usually goes for non-celebrity memoirs too, and a completely finished and polished book proposal for nonfiction. So before you even query, you want to make sure you're ready and that you have those things ready to go. So, how to write a killer plot summary for fiction or your key selling points for nonfiction. We're going to start with fiction. So, I get it. It's daunting to reduce your entire sprawling novel or memoir down to a brief summary, but you really can do it. Your book is not a special unicorn that can't possibly be summarized, even though it might feel that way sometimes. You can boil down your novel. Trust me, I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. So you need to flesh out into a 2 to 3 paragraph plot description. So if you're writing a novel or memoir, the most important way to think about this is to synthesize the quest of your novel or memoir. So your protagonist or your core characters, they want something big, they go after that thing, they encounter obstacles along the way, and they end up somewhere else. In order to illustrate how to synthesize this in the query letter, I have a handy dandy query letter Mad Lib, remember those from when we were kids, to help you write a plot description. And it goes a little something like this. Your protagonist's name is a description, describe them, living in setting, a place where your novel's set. When complicating incident happens, protagonist must go on a quest and verb the villain in order to achieve the protagonist's goal, or else, here's what happens if it goes wrong, here's what's at stake. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use Star Wars, even though it's not a novel, it's a movie, just because everyone's familiar. So here's how it goes. Luke Skywalker is a moisture farm boy living on Tatooine. When he encounters a mysterious droid who displays a message from a princess in danger, Luke must learn the Force and blow up the Death Star in order to save the Galactic Rebellion. Pretty decent plot summary of Star Wars, right? Now, it's just a starting place, and ideally you want to weave in a little bit more flavor, a little bit more context, like what the Force is in case someone doesn't know, and you want to flesh it out to those 2 to 3 paragraphs of plot description. But as you flesh it out and as you add meat on the bones, all of those core elements of the quest should be present. So I have 2 main tips for writing a killer plot description. And the first one, summarize with specificity. Summarize with specificity. Too many people channel the movie trailer voice of God in their query letter. It's like, in a world unlike our own, 2 friends must go on a journey to save the world. But without any visuals, that doesn't actually tell us anything. You have to be specific when you describe what's in your novel. So here's an example of what I mean by that. Let's say in your query letter you have Amy's husband suffered a horrible accident. Okay, I mean, it's a summary. It tells us broadly what happened, but that could mean almost anything. When he had an accident, did he crash his car, or was he accidentally zapped by mutant space monkeys? When you're thinking about specificity, it's not about making your query letter longer. Swapping suffered a horrible accident with accidentally zapped by mutant space monkeys, it's basically the same number of words, but one is way more specific than the other and gives way more of the flavor of the novel. So always look for ways you can swap out what's vague with what actually happened in a specific and tangible way. Again, you don't have to add a bunch more words to be specific. Just look for places where you can swap out what's vague with what's specific. And as you're doing this, don't worry about spoilers. Agents don't read the same way as an average reader does. They're going to read something 100 times before it gets published, and they can put themselves in the shoes of a reader who's never read it before. They just want to know what happens. So you don't necessarily have to tell the agent how it ends, but if you have a choice between including a spoiler and just being clear what happens, just spoil it. Just err on the side of being clear. My second main tip for writing a killer plot description is to weave in the voice. So once you get the plot description in a good place, look for opportunities to draw upon your protagonist's voice or the overall tone and spirit of your novel. Give the agent a sense of what it's like to read your novel. So for instance, instead of saying something bland like George had a bad day at work, think about how George, your character, would describe that day. What would he say about it? Depending on his personality, he might say something like George had a piss poor day in the coal mines, or George was ready to smash every cubicle in his grubby office hell. But either of those are way more vivid and draws upon more personality than something basic and bland like George had a bad day. As you're writing your plot description, try to give the agent a sense of what it would be like to read your novel. For nonfiction, it's important to understand and articulate your key selling points. So for any kind of narrative nonfiction like memoir or narrative history, you can use the novel structure of the plot description because chances are they have some kind of a quest. But for something more prescriptive, like self-help or something like that, you want to get more at the nubby essence of your book. What is the challenge your book promises to solve, and how does it do it? So, in my opinion, one of the absolute best one-sentence pitches for nonfiction is the actual title of He's Just Not That Into You, which conveys the essence of the book in a very flavorful way. Just from the title, you know exactly what you're getting, and you could draw upon something like that as you're writing a query letter too. But another structure that could potentially work for nonfiction goes like this. So you have this problem, but what if we could improve everything in this much more optimistic scenario? Here's how this book promises to take us there, and here's why I'm the best person in the entire world to write this book. It gives you a pretty good starting place to flesh out a nonfiction description in a query letter. How and why to personalize your query letter. I want to get this out of the way right up front. It's not about kissing up. That's not why you're doing it. So when I was a literary agent, again, I read thousands and thousands of query letters, sometimes dozens a day. And over the course of reading all those query letters, I noticed a correlation between the authors who personalized and the authors who wrote professional queries. So when I saw that a query was personalized, it tipped me off. It made me pay a little bit closer attention. And if you think about it, it's the same thing for job applications and in business and things like that. The personalized touch really counts. Now, you don't have to go overboard or anything like, you don't have to be elaborate. Just say something about the agent that couldn't have been copy and pasted and said about someone else. So as you're researching agents, just take note of little things you can use to personalize. Like you saw something they said in an interview, or you noticed an author or two that they represented that you like. It really doesn't have to be much. Just start your query with a line of personalization that says why you queried them, and get on with the rest of your plot description, because that's the thing that's the most important. So the nuts and bolts of the query letter, things like genre, word count, comp titles, and bio that you need to include. Now, I want to be clear, the most important thing in the query letter is the plot description or the summary of your book for nonfiction. That's by far the most important part, which is why we started there. But there are a few other things the agent is going to be looking for in your query letter, and you want to make sure that you include them. So first, you need to include your genre. A lot of authors get really hung up on this, but even if your book straddles genres or incorporates multiple elements, it needs to have a base. You don't need to know your micro genre or get overly specific. And when in doubt, you can just shoot for the section of the bookstore you think your book is going to end up on. It's okay to say something like science fiction or horror or self-help or something like that. It's okay to be simple. You also want to include your word count. And also, I have some advice. It's important to understand what's customary for your genre. There aren't hard and fast rules around word count, but excessively long or excessively short will decrease your odds, so you should be aware of that going in. But you want to be clear about your word count in your query letter. So comp titles, which are sometimes translated to competitive titles, some to comparative titles, but they're books that are similar to yours. You want to consider including at least 2 to 3 comp titles. Not every agent requires these, but many do take them seriously. So as you're thinking about them, the most important thing to keep in mind here is who's the audience for your book. Think less in terms of the themes and the content and more in terms of the audience. Whose readers do you want? It's fine to include some TV shows and movies, but always make sure to include at least one book that was published in the last 5 to 10 years that experienced some success. You want to show the agent there's a current market for your book. And also avoid household names like Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and things that were massive, massive successes that everyone uses. Bio. So for fiction, you don't need publication credits to send a query letter. If you have them, great, but you can just give the agent a sense of who you are. It's fine to just say, this is my first novel and this is what I do for a living. I didn't have publication credits before I published Jacob Wonderbar. So for fiction, really remember that what's most important is the plot description. For nonfiction, it's a little different, especially for things like prescriptive nonfiction. It can be more important to have a platform, which I like to define platform as a combination of authority and eyeballs. So authority meaning you're one of the leading experts in your field, and eyeballs meaning you have a sizable built-in audience who's ready to be among your first readers. So giving the agent a sense of your authority and your audience is really important in the bio in your query letter for nonfiction. So the best strategy for sending out query letters. First, you need to research literary agents. As you're doing this, I highly recommend creating a spreadsheet where you can take note of submission procedures and things like that. You really want to make sure you follow these closely, so really take note of them. But as you're doing this, you can also look for little tidbits that you can use to personalize, things like those interviews and books that the agent represented. Then, when you're ready to send out your query, send it out in batches. Make sure your query is out with 7 to 10 agents at any given time. If you receive a rejection, send another query out. If you haven't heard back from someone in 2 months, send another query out. Sometimes agents have no response means no policies. The reason to go about it this way is that it gives you a chance to evaluate your approach as you go along. If you send out 10 to 15 queries and you aren't getting any requests from agents to see more of your manuscript or proposal, it probably means something isn't working with your query, but it gives you a chance to pull it back and reconsider your approach. There are other ways to approach agents at things like conferences and Twitter pitches, and so a lot of people ask about how to go about it when there's so many avenues. I wouldn't go all in on just one strategy. I would first figure out the top agents that you want to query, then decide on the best way that you want to approach them. So if one agent prefers queries, send them a query. If another is active on Twitter and prefers Twitter pitches, then you can do that. So there are lots of ins and outs of literary agent etiquette, like when to follow up on this and that. And it's too much to get into in one video, but there are lots of resources on my website, nathanbransford.com, that will help you go about this process as professionally as possible. My query letter for Jacob Wonderbar. So when I wrote Jacob Wonderbar, I was a literary agent and I had read thousands and thousands of query letters. And so then I had to put together everything I learned to write my own because I needed to write one to find an agent. So just to show you I practice what I preach, here's my query letter. It starts with personalization. As a young literary agent with Curtis Brown Limited, I have long admired Inkwell as well as your strong track record. To paraphrase Douglas Adams, if you search for a book that was almost, but not quite entirely unlike The Book Thief, which I absolutely loved, you might just have Jacob Wonderbar and the Cosmic Space Kapow, a middle grade and up science fiction novel that I just completed. Still fun, but no one dies. Mr. Death will be lonely. So, started with the personalization, now transitioning to the plot description. Jacob Wonderbar has been the bane of every substitute teacher at Magellan Middle School ever since his dad moved away from home. He never would have survived without his best friend Dexter, even if he's a little timid, and his cute but tough friend Sarah Daisy, who is chronically overscheduled. But when the trio meets a mysterious man in silver one night, they trade a corn dog for a sassy spaceship and blast off into the great unknown. So try to synthesize the first part of the quest in the first paragraph. Now to the second paragraph. That is, until they break the universe in a giant space kapow, and a nefarious space buccaneer named Mick Kraken maroons Jacob and Dexter on a tiny planet that smells like burp breath. The friends have to work together to make it back to their little street where the houses look the same, even as Earth seems farther and farther away. So I really tried to synthesize the quest with specific details and voice in the second part of the plot description. Now the nuts and bolts. Jacob Wonderbar and the Cosmic Space Kapow is 50,000 words and stands alone, but I have ideas for a series, including titles such as Jacob Wonderbar for President of the Universe and Jacob Wonderbar and the Vacationing Aliens from Another Planet. I'm the author of an eponymous agenting and writing blog. I'd be thrilled if you would consider Wonderbar for representation, and a few other agents are considering simultaneously. Thanks very much, and hope to talk to you soon. So in my own query letter, I really tried to put all of this together. Personalization, two paragraphs of plot description with voice and specificity, the nuts and bolts, and just brief bio and closing message. So that's how I did it. You probably know that the odds of going through the query process can feel really daunting, but it really does happen. I want to reassure you, it really does happen. Every single day, agents are offering representation and debut authors are receiving book deals. Also, you've come this far, and even being at the stage you're at is a real accomplishment, even being at the stage of considering querying. So take the time to congratulate yourself, and really nice work. And try not to take this process too seriously. There's so much that's out of your control. At the end of the day, all you can do is write the best book you can, write the best pitch you can, but the market's gonna do what the market's gonna do. But still, you're doing what you can. You're on the right track. You're doing your research, and you're a step closer just by watching this video. So as you go along, just try to enjoy the process. And if you need any help with anything, I really hope you'll consider me a resource, and please feel free to reach out to me at nathanbransford.com. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you for including me on your writing journey.